Today in the Daily Dose, historic plagues and pandemics. Pandemic typhoid. Characterized by a slow progressive fever and prolific diarrhea, typhoid became known as one of the most feared conditions throughout the 19th century. Today we know that typhoid is dependent upon humans for transmission, passed victim to victim via poor sanitation or contamination by human waste. Very little is known about the early history of typhoid. However, many historians believe that typhoid took the lives of more than 6,000 settlers in the English colony of Jamestown, Virginia between 1607 and 1624. During the American Civil War, records indicate that over 81,000 Union troops died from either typhoid or dysentery. And then there's the bizarre case of Mary Mallon, better known as Typhoid Mary, a social predicament which set new legal boundaries regarding the rights of the individual versus public safety at large. In the summer of 1906, New York banker Charles Henry Warren rented a summer home from the Thompson family of Oyster Bay, Long Island. Besides the usual cadre of maids and gardeners, Warren hired a young Irish immigrant, Mary Mallon, to be the family's summer cook. On August 27th, one of the Warrens' daughters fell ill with typhoid fever, followed by Mrs. Warren, two maids, a gardener, and a second Warren daughter. Fearing that no one would ever rent their summer home again, the Thompsons hired experienced typhoid investigator George Soper to investigate the outbreak. Suspecting Mary Mallon as the carrier, Soper traced her employment history back to 1900. In the process, Soper discovered that Mallon had held 7 jobs as a cook, sickening 22 people with typhoid and causing the death of one young girl. When Mallon refused to give Soper the necessary samples required for a positive identification of typhoid, he returned with Dr. Josephine Baker and 5 police officers. Instead of submission, Mallon lunged at Soper with a carving fork before fleeing the scene. When the police finally caught up with her 5 hours later, they were forced to literally sit on Mallon as they transported her to the health department on North Brother Island. Believing that she was being unfairly persecuted, Mary Mallon began a long string of legal battles in an effort to regain her freedom. "I never had typhoid in my life," she emphatically maintained. "Why should I be banished like a leper and compelled to live in solitary confinement with only a dog for a companion?" After 4 years of imprisonment, Mallon was set free on the promise that she would never cook again for other people. In January of 1915, nearly 5 years after her release, the Sloan Maternity Hospital in Manhattan suffered a typhoid outbreak. 25 people became ill with 2 confirmed fatalities. Evidence pointed to a recently hired cook, one Mrs. Brown, a pseudonym an enraged public would soon learn for one Mary Mallon. Mallon was sent back to North Brother Island, this time for the remainder of her natural life. 17 years later, she suffered a massive stroke, which crippled her with complete left-side paralysis. She died 6 years after that on November 11, 1938, after spending over half her life in solitary confinement. The historical upside to human pandemics. While epidemics have ravaged human societies throughout recorded history, global health challenges have also sparked progress in culture, economics, and civilization, ultimately changing the lives of the survivors for the better. For instance, after the massive losses to serfdom labor resulting from the Black Death of 1347, agricultural workers were able to demand better pay and working conditions, from their manorial lords. In urban areas following the plague, authorities became more aware of the importance of public sanitation in curbing pandemics, spawning the precursors to modern concepts of public health. In 1793, following a yellow fever epidemic that swept through Philadelphia, then the largest city in America and the nation's temporary capital, the pandemic caused sweeping changes by the Founding Fathers. Home to such notables as George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton, the yellow fever epidemic convinced them that the social, economic, and political health of the nation was inextricably tied up with public health, leading to vast improvements in both policy and law. In the 1920s, following the heavy losses to the flu pandemic of 1918, governments around the world embraced new concepts of preventative and socialized medicine, putting in place centralized healthcare systems that exist to this day. While in the United States, employer-based healthcare insurance plans were put in place for the first time in the nation's history. The flu pandemic of 1918 also inspired physicians and scientists to focus on the occupational and social conditions that promoted illness, not only to cure the illness in question, but to install epidemiological practices to further study the patterns, causes, and effects of infectious disease transmission. The repeatable nature of pandemics has also led to increased vaccination against recurrent diseases such as measles, malaria, and polio, to name just a few. Following the flu pandemic of 1918, the concept of social distancing further influenced residential building design, prompting legislation by Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1930s that required all apartments to have fire escapes, wider hallways, and separate bathrooms. Social distancing also found its way into fashion when the advent of hoop-skirt dresses provided a much-needed distancing tactic from men. The Dancing Plague of 1518. The 3-month-long hysteria began on July 14th, 1518, when Frau Trophia walked out of her Strasbourg home to throw down some original dance moves for her immediately infected neighbors, which she kept up without pause or sleep for the next 6 days. By the end of Strasbourg's first month of nonstop dancing, nearly 400 people danced behind Frau Trophia to the point of exhaustion and collapse. Called St. John's Dance at the time, the disease quickly spread up and down the Rhine River, including cities such as Liege, Utrecht, and Tongres, as well as other cities in the Netherlands and Belgium. That the event took place is undisputed, says historian John Waller, whose enticing book A Time to Dance, A Time to Die was published in 2008 based on research supported by historical records of the dancing plague, including physician notes, cathedral sermons, as well as local and regional chronicles describing the mass outbreak of dancing. Back in Strasbourg, head-scratched town officials tried to contain the now citywide dance fever by hiring musicians to perform before a hastily constructed and quite massive stage, which ultimately had the opposite effect of prompting more townspeople to join in on the communal hysteria. Modern experts remain mixed regarding what caused the outbreak of marathon dancing, although some historians have suggested that hallucinatory ergot was to blame, which is a mold that grows on stalks of damp rye wheat that can be unwittingly baked into loaves of bread. Still others believe the mass dance outbreak was caused by extreme psychological duress, while a third camp points the finger at a secret religious cult. 2 years after the dance frenzy had ended, humanist Hieronymus Gibwiller described the dance plague as God's way of forcing modesty and moderation upon the city of Strasbourg. And while the dance plague ended just as quickly as it had arrived, dozens of danced-out people in Strasbourg and beyond had died from heart attacks, strokes, and sheer exhaustion. Pandemic typhus. Typhus victims experience nausea, fever and rash, progressive delirium, gangrenous sores, severe headaches, and a piercing sensitivity to light. The name typhus comes from the ancient Greek word typhos, meaning smoky or lazy, which describes the state of mind of those afflicted by late-stage disease. Before the creation of a vaccine in World War II, typhus held rank with some of the worst human epidemics throughout modern history. The responsible bacteria, identified today as Rickettsia prausickia, is now known to be widespread in rodent populations, although it ultimately transmits to humans via mites, fleas, body lice, and the North American flying squirrel. Until the middle of the 20th century, typhus epidemics exploded under conditions of overcrowding, environmental pollution, poverty, hunger, physical exhaustion, and war. American bacteriologist Hans Zinser once wrote that typhus came to be the inevitable and expected companion of war and revolution. No encampment, no campaigning army, and no besieged city escaped its wrath. In 1489, when the Spanish attacked the Moors in Granada, of the 25,000-man army active in the campaign, 3,000 were lost to combat, while 17,000 were lost to typhus. During the 30 Years' War, when Catholics, Lutherans, and Calvinists fought for religious superiority in Central Europe, typhus again felled more troops than combat. During one battle in 1632, when Swedish King Adolphus and Catholic commander Baron von Wallenstein dug in their troops for battle, typhus struck down 18,000 soldiers on either side, forcing both commanders to withdraw their remaining troops and call an end to the engagement. During Napoleon's retreat from Moscow in 1812, of his 500,000-man fighting force, 80,000 were lost to typhus. Like the First World War itself, typhus began in Serbia with 10,000 losses as early as November of 1914. Within 6 months, the typhus death toll had risen sharply to 150,000. While delousing stations kept the disease in check for troops on the Western Front, by the end of the war, typhus took nearly 3 million lives in Russia, Poland, and Romania, while an additional 3 million were lost during the Russian Civil War of 1917 to 1921. Adding to the already horrific conditions inflicted upon Jews and enemy combatants in Nazi concentration camps, typhus took the lives of many who might have otherwise survived the inhuman ordeal, including the young diarist Anne Frank and her sister Margot. In North America, typhus epidemics struck Philadelphia in 1837, followed by an outbreak in 1843 Concord, New Hampshire, which killed the son of Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States. Similar outbreaks ravaged Baltimore, Memphis, and Washington, D.C. between the years of 1865 and 1873. The rise of the Industrial Revolution further strengthened typhus as a killer disease. Combined with foul housing, overflowing cesspools, poverty, malnutrition, and worker fatigue, typhus was a key component in holding human life expectancies to less than 40 years of age. Today, typhus remains virtually wiped out in North America, thanks to the advent of antibiotics such as tetracycline, an effective array of vaccines, and even more effective water treatment practices and rodent lice eradication efforts. In the Third World, however, while typhus remains reasonably in check, fast-rising urban growth rates in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa present a dangerous potential for additional life-threatening epidemics. The Great Plague of London. caused by the transmission of the Yersinia pestis bacteria from rats to humans, born on the Xenopsilla Cheops fleet before the age of scientific understanding. Black Death or bubonic plague ravaged Europe in 1347 and 48, returning to London 3 times before its 4th and final outbreak in 1665. Symptoms of bubonic plague include fever and chills, severe headaches and malaise, nausea, vomiting, seizures, delirium, and death. Derived from the ancient Greek word bubo, meaning swollen gland, buboes generally appear in the armpits and groin of their victim. Other symptoms include petechia, or bruised purplish skin splotches on the chest, back, and neck, known as God's tokens, since petechiae always meant that the victim had a fatal case of the disease. Diarists also reported that victims who appeared to be on death's doorstep from plague smelled like they were as well. First suspected in late 1664, by April of 65, Black Death spread in an easterly direction from the down-and-out suburb of St. Giles onward through the crowded, rat-infested neighborhoods of Whitechapel and Stepney, finally overtaking the walled city of London. By September of 1665, death rates exceeded 8,000 per week, as helpless government officials abandoned all notions of quarantining the dead and dying. Wealthy Londoners soon fled for the countryside, while the destitute poor wandered the streets in fear, listening to the sound of "Bring Out Your Dead" as city workers stacked plague victims on carts bound for parish graveyards or communal plague pits such as Finsbury Field or Southwark. Fearing cats and dogs as the source of the contagion, tens of thousands were put down out of an abundance of caution, while physicians lanced the buboes of plague victims under the Galenistic misconception that a cure could be achieved by releasing trapped ill humors. Diarist Samuel Pepys wrote of desperate people aimlessly wandering the streets, later writing that bells rang out constantly, announcing the death or burial of yet another plague victim. The Great Plague ended on September 2, 1666, when fire broke out in the King's Bakery on Pudding Lane, burning much of London to the ground over the next 4 days of conflagration, torching some 13,200 homes and businesses, which forever reshaped the geographic footprint of central London. Taking some 100,000 lives, roughly a quarter of London's population at the time, the Great Plague was the last to strike the city after centuries of sporadic outbreaks, making the Great Plague of 1665 yet another worst hard time for London town. Pandemic cholera. Characterized by nausea, vomiting, and copious bouts of diarrhea, up to 5.5 gallons a day. Untreated cholera patients soon become dangerously dehydrated. Nearing death, victims display the classic cholera physiognomy of puckered blue lips and cadaverous, sunken facial features. Children between the ages of 2 and 4 hold the dubious distinction of the highest rates of infection. Rooted in the Indian subcontinent, cholera became one of the most widespread and deadly diseases of the 19th century, taking the lives of an estimated 30 million people worldwide. Cholera remained a geographically isolated disease until the start of the 19th century, when the first pandemic struck Bengal, India in 1816. By 1824, religious pilgrims, soldiers, and traders had transported the disease into Southeast Asia and China, then onward to the Russian border and east into Japan. It then followed trade routes into the Persian Gulf, decimating present-day Iran before marching across the Ottoman and Russian empires. By 1826, cholera threatened to enter Europe, but as quickly as the epidemic began, the disease subsided after reaching Astrakhan near the Caspian Sea. The second, third, and fourth waves of cholera epidemics were far less merciful than the first. It is estimated that in India alone, 8 million people died from cholera between 1900 and 1920. In 1854, English physician John Snow was the first to identify the importance of contaminated water as one of the causal vectors of cholera transmission. A year later, he published 2 groundbreaking field studies, which demonstrated that improper sewage containment was responsible for 2 epidemics that crippled parts of London in 1854. Despite early skepticism by many in the medical community, as the science of microbiology developed over the next 30 years, mounting evidence would prove that Snow's original assumptions were correct. Developed cities began to make heavy investments in water treatment facilities positioned well away from sewers and waste containment structures. As a result, cholera epidemics ended in direct relationship to infrastructure improvements. In 1883, while traveling in Egypt with German colleagues, Robert Koch came face to face with cholera when an epidemic broke out in Alexandria. Following necropsies of the dead, Koch and his team found a bacillus in the intestinal mucosa of persons who had died from cholera. Late in 1883, Koch requested authorization for his team to sail to Calcutta, India to investigate a second cholera outbreak. This time, on January 7, 1884, Koch announced to the world that he had isolated and identified the Vibrio cholerae bacillus as the bug responsible for the disease. Koch and his team returned to Germany as national heroes. First tuberculosis, the headlines announced, now cholera. The science world would later discover that Italian anatomist Filippo Piccini had isolated and identified Vibrio cholerae almost 30 years earlier while working at the University of Florence. However, Koch and the science world at large remain unaware of Piccini's discovery due to inadequate publication of his results. In 1900, Russian-born bacteriologist Waldemar Hofkin developed the first vaccine against the disease. Combined with improved sanitation infrastructures in most major cities, cholera epidemics have remained largely in check throughout the world. The last major outbreak in the United States occurred in 1910, while an outbreak in 1947 Egypt took the lives of 20,000 victims. In 2010, after a massive earthquake left Haiti with an enormous homeless population and an almost non-existent sanitation system, cholera struck down over 250 lives when an outbreak erupted in Port-au-Prince. As the Haitian outbreak belies, when given the opportunity, Vibrio cholerae remains a lethal, unseen enemy even to this day. The plagues of San Francisco. In the summer of 1899, a ship sailing from Hong Kong arrived into San Francisco Bay with 2 active cases of bubonic plague on board, prompting health officials to quarantine the infected on Angel Island. After custom agents made a second search of the ship, 11 stowaways were discovered, and when 2 of the unticketed passengers escaped their detention, their bodies were later found in the bay, both testing positive for bubonic plague. Despite the potential for a looming disaster, California Governor Henry Gage labeled health department concerns as fake news, unwilling to risk the state's heavy economic reliance on outside trade, which in turn enabled the first wave of a plague pandemic to spread throughout the Bay Area from 1900 to 1904. Given the anti-Asian racist tenor of the day, some 18 years after Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, residents in Chinatown took the brunt of the blame for the rising pandemic, while for his callous disregard and cover-up, Gage was voted out of office in 1902. By the time the outbreak was contained in 1904, 121 cases had been identified, with 119 fatalities. 2 years later, much of the city's urban center was destroyed by the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, driving thousands of San Franciscans into homeless encampments during the rebuild process, which proved to be a field day for scavenging rats. For a disease caused by the transmission of the Yersinia pestis bacteria from rats to humans, born on the Xenopsilla cheops flea, the city's tragic natural disaster led to a second wave of plague outbreaks in the summer of 1907, prompting city officials to undertake a rat eradication campaign that cost city residents over $2 million, or $62 million in today's currency. After health officials proved without a doubt that the second outbreak occurred outside of Chinatown, in June of 1908, 160 fresh cases of plague had been identified, with a reduced mortality rate compared to the first outbreak of just 78 lives. During the Bay Area's second outbreak of plague, health officials pointed to infected immigrants from Europe, while this time around, the transmission vector was pinned on the lowly California ground squirrel, which remains a virulent carrier of plague to this day. Thanks to the cold-hearted indifference of the state's leading politician, the ousted governor's initial denial gave the dreaded and quite deadly bubonic plague its first foothold in America, leading to sporadic outbreaks in the years to come, making the San Francisco plagues of the early 20th century a potential powder keg for pandemic loss. The Spanish flu of 1918. Nearly everyone, at least once in their life, has experienced an infectious episode of common influenza. Flu symptoms include headaches, nausea, fever and chills, muscle ache, general malaise, and sinus congestion. Known simply as the flu, influenza is a recurrent infectious disease caused by RNA viruses of the orthomyxoviridae family of viral pathogens. Known as Spanish flu or La Gripa, in 1918, 3 waves of H1N1 spread throughout the world at a staggering pace. The majority of those afflicted by La Gripa recovered fully, but in some patients the disease worsened to pneumonia, against which modern medicine at the time had no viable defense. Victims of this lethal stage of infection developed a bluish cast to their faces, which would ultimately turn purple or brown. Once a victim's feet turned black, death was generally only hours away. Spanish flu invaded cities across the globe in an almost random fashion, hopscotching around the world without apparent logic or predictable demographic progression. Boston, Massachusetts; Freetown in Sierra Leone; Brest, France. In San Francisco, over 3,500 pneumonia cases were admitted to area hospitals, with over 900 fatalities. Everywhere in the United States, public gatherings were banned. Schools, theaters, churches, and businesses were shut down by public decree. Nearly everyone wore face masks, yet nothing seemed to arrest the spread of influenza. Considered the greatest single most demographic shock that mankind has ever experienced, in 2 years that Spanish flu ravaged the earth, 1/5 of the world's population became infected, with an estimated mortality of 50 to 100 million lives. In one devastating year, Spanish flu killed more people than Hitler, nuclear weapons, and all worldwide terrorist attacks combined. In the end, despite frantic efforts to unlock its etiology and devise an effective cure, Spanish flu disappeared from the human landscape as quickly as it had arrived. Mask slackers and the Spanish flu of 1918. While the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 extracted a far greater mortality than the coronavirus pandemic of 2020, an estimated 50 to 100 million lives worldwide, health officials in 1918 grappled with the same mask slacker behaviors widely experienced in 2020. Much like COVID lockdowns, the Spanish flu saw the same closures of schools, businesses, and theaters, while public health officials encouraged people to cough or sneeze into a handkerchief, a practice that didn't completely catch on until after the pandemic was over. In Philadelphia, streetcar signs warned that spitting spread death, while the New York City Health Department even advised people not to kiss except through a handkerchief. In Western states, some cities adopted mandatory mask ordinances, posing the argument that wearing one was a patriotic duty. In October of 1918, the San Francisco Chronicle ran a public service announcement which said that the man or woman or child who will not wear a mask now is a dangerous slacker, which was a direct reference to the type of World War I slacker who refused to fight or help out in the war effort. One sign in California went so far as to threaten jail time for any and all mask slackers who refused to comply. For the most part, Americans in the western United States complied with the original mask order, but when a second spike in cases hit in January 1919, leading San Francisco officials to implement a second masking order, the mandate was met with increasing resistance. At the behest of the Surgeon General's office, newspapers around the country published a cartoon of a man hacking in public that warned, "Coughs and sneezes spread diseases as dangerous as poison gas shells," another direct reference between fighting the flu and fighting the First World War. The value of fresh air through open windows cannot be overemphasized, Surgeon General Rupert Blue wrote to the American people. When crowding is unavoidable, as in streetcars, care should be taken to keep the face so turned as to not inhale directly the air breathed out by another person. Today, while pandemics are far from new to humanity, the one certainty, it appears, is that human behavior, both then and now, is the primary vector that guarantees the spread of a newly arrived pathogen into a worldwide health disaster. Maurice Hilleman predicts a deadly pandemic. In April of 1957, a new strain of a lethal respiratory virus emerged in East Asia, which caught local health authorities completely off guard. Today, in the age of COVID-19, the scenario sounds frighteningly familiar, and while more than an estimated 1.1 million would die worldwide, the early warning response by microbiologist Maurice Hilleman has been credited with potentially saving 1 million American lives. Heading up the influenza monitoring effort at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, Hilleman saw the problem coming and prepared the United States ahead of time. This one has the potential to become a pandemic, he later recalled, and it would soon be upon us. Believing he was looking at a novel influenza strain, Hilleman arranged for the U.S. military to ship samples of the pathogen from its origins in Hong Kong to his laboratory in Washington, D.C. For 5 days and nights, his team tested the virus against blood from thousands of Americans, discovering that the H2N2 virus was unlike any flu that humans were known to have encountered in the past. Hilleman moved quickly to alert the government, going so far as to predict that the virus would hit the U.S. during the first week of September, right when schools were about to reopen. In the intervening years since the Spanish flu of 1918, however, health officials had lost sight of the deadly power of aggressive strains of influenza viruses, prompting the U.S. Health Service to turn a blind eye on Hilleman's warnings. "I was declared crazy," Hilleman would later recall. Fortunately, Hilleman held clout in the pharmaceutical industry, and after the government refused to act, Hilleman sent H2N2 samples to the 6 largest pharmaceutical companies, who responded by developing vaccines against the contagion. While 116,000 American lives would be lost during the pandemic of 1957 and 58, Hilleman's swift and perceptive action against government inaction led one researcher to attest in a New York Times article that Hilleman's persistence saved the lives of 1 million Americans, making Maurice Hilleman a one-man army against the spread of pandemic disease. And there you have it, historic plagues and pandemics. Today's Daily Dose documentary is brought to you by PlatosPeach.com, a lesson planning tool leveraging content like this and much more for educators and homeschooling parents. Check out the description for more information so that you too can teach something new every day.